She held my gaze for one long, unhurried moment. Then she set the kinetic pistol carefully back in its place, took a plasma rifle from the rack with the mild resignation of someone accepting a consolation prize, and walked to the firing line where Gernok had just stomped away, muttering something in Krellian that definitely violated at least 3 provisions of the conduct code. What happened next was witnessed by 17 recruits, one increasingly bewildered instructor, and a range computer that later appeared to pause for nearly a full second before catching up with reality. "Your grip is completely wrong," announced Specialist Thran, a Telvarian with more opinions and accuracy who had scored just barely above minimum qualification the previous week and had apparently decided this entitled him to a teaching position. "That hand position will compromise your entire shot. The manual clearly states that the support thumb should be positioned." "I know what the manual states," Kira said, not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed downrange, calm and distant, like someone reading a map they had memorized long ago and were now simply verifying against the terrain. "Then why are you holding it like you're strangling something?" She did not respond. Her grip was, by every standard in our training doctrine, catastrophically wrong. Her thumb crossed over the top of the receiver instead of running along the side. Her stance was compressed, contracted, as if she were deliberately making herself smaller, occupying less space than her body required. Nothing about her posture matched the centuries-refined techniques we had spent generations refining and teaching. "Target is hot," the range computer announced. "You may fire when ready." She fired. The plasma bolt screamed downrange, and I opened my mouth to begin my standard lecture about luck and beginner's flukes and the importance of not developing poor habits from accidental success. The bolt hit dead center. Perfect score zone. Fluke, I thought. It happens. Beginners get lucky. She fired again. Same result. And again. 4 more shots followed in rapid succession, so fast that the sound of each discharge was still fading when the next one arrived. Every single bolt landed within a handspan of each other, clustered at the absolute center of that glowing target with a precision that made the grouping look almost surgical. Tighter than anything I had seen from a first-day recruit. Tighter, frankly, than anything I had seen from most graduates. The range fell completely silent, broken only by the cooling hum of the plasma rifle. "Next target," Kira said. The range computer, apparently working through something existential, took a moment before responding. Then the target began moving, side to side in a randomized variable speed pattern. Advanced qualification. We did not test that until week 3, after recruits had already built a solid foundation of fundamentals. She tracked it, that terrible grip, that compressed, wrong everything stance, and she absolutely dismantled that moving target. 8 shots, 8 hits. The final 3 connected while the target was accelerating, each bolt leading the movement with the practice, fluid ease of someone who had been doing this not for weeks or months, but for years, for most of a lifetime. Fran's mandibles hung open. Gernok had returned from wherever he had stumped off to and was standing at the back of the range, very still, staring. The entire room had gone quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something happens that does not fit inside the existing framework of understanding, when the universe decides, without warning or apology, to revise its own rules. "Can you set the 100-meter target?" Kira asked. "That's outside basic qualification range," I said. My voice came out slower than I intended. "I know." It was not a request. The tone made that perfectly clear. This was no longer about qualification scores. This was about making a point that she had apparently decided needed making, and she was going to make it whether I cooperated or not. I nodded to the range computer. The target appeared at 100 meters. For context, effective plasma rifle range was 60 to 70 meters at best. Beyond that, the energy bolt dispersed and lost coherence, spreading and fading until it could no longer deliver meaningful impact. Hitting a standard target at 100 meters with a plasma rifle was roughly equivalent to trying to catch rain in a net, theoretically conceivable, practically pointless. Kira shifted her weight. A minute adjustment, almost imperceptible, a slight change in shoulder angle, a fractional repositioning of her feet. Then she did something that made several of us exchange glances. She looked over the holographic targeting system entirely, sighting instead through the basic iron sights that most operators treated as vestigial decoration. Nobody used iron sights. They were a legacy feature, kept in the design out of some vague sense of historical completeness. She fired 5 times in measured, unhurried succession. Every shot connected. The grouping was wider than at 50 meters. Plasma diffusion at extreme range made that inevitable, but she was landing consistent hits at a distance where most species could not even resolve the target with their unaided eyes. The range computer registered each impact with a tone that sounded, to my ears at least, increasingly uncertain about its own data. How? Gernok rumbled from the back of the room. It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a very large, very capable warrior attempting to reorganize a worldview that had just been quietly dismantled. Kira lowered the rifle and turned to face us for the first time. There was no smugness in her expression, no performance of satisfaction, no conscious display of superiority. What I saw instead was something more interesting and more unsettling, the quiet, patient look of someone delivering a fact they have had to explain many times before, to many different audiences, always with the same result. "Wrong for you," she said simply. "Not for me. Different species, different physiology. What works for a Krell doesn't work for a Telvarian. What works for a Telvarian doesn't work for a human." "But the Doctrine," Thran protested, his voice carrying particular fragility of someone whose certainties are crumbling. "Standard technique has been tested and validated across hundreds of species over centuries. The grip you're using isn't biomechanically sound. It should reduce accuracy, increase fatigue, compromise shot placement." "Should," Kira agreed. "For you. Not for me." I stepped forward, and as I did, something shifted in my thinking, a crack forming in a wall I had not realized I had built. I had spent 6 cycles teaching marksmanship. I knew weapons doctrine the way I knew my own name, the way I knew the smell of this range in the morning. But looking at Kira's hands, genuinely, carefully looking at them, comparing them to my own and to the appendages of the other recruits, I began to see something I should have seen far earlier had I ever thought to look. Human hands were different, profoundly, architecturally different. The thumb opposed the fingers in a way that was rare among spacefaring species, enabling grip configurations that most of our anatomies simply could not replicate. The fine motor control was extraordinary, and their grip strength, relative to overall body size, was remarkable in a way that no standard-issue equipment had ever been designed to accommodate, because no one had thought to ask. "Show me your hands," I said. She raised them. I compared them to my own, to Gernok's massive appendages, to Thran's long multi-jointed Telvarian fingers, to the various other configurations around the room. The differences were immediately and dramatically apparent, once you were actually paying attention. How had we never done this before? How had we issued plasma rifles to human recruits without once considering whether the weapons had been designed with their anatomy in mind? "That grip," I said slowly. "What is it called?" "C-clamp," she said. "Sometimes called thumb overbore. It's standard technique for managing recoil on kinetic weapons. Keeps the muzzle flat, reduces climb between shots, allows faster and more accurate follow-up fire. Plasma rifles don't have recoil." "No," she agreed, with the patience of someone who has answered this exact objection before. "But they produce neurofeedback that humans can feel distinctly in the hands and forearms. A kind of resonance from the discharge cycle. The grip compensates for that sensation, keeps our aim stable through rapid fire. Without it, the feedback throws us off in ways that probably aren't even measurable in non-human subjects, because non-human subjects don't experience it." I stared at her. Neurofeedback from plasma weapon discharge cycles affecting human targeting accuracy. It had never appeared in any study I had read, any manual I had reviewed, any briefing I had attended. Of course it had not. Those studies had been conducted exclusively on Telvarian and Krell and Vian subjects. No one had apparently thought to conduct the same research on humans, because humans had only recently been integrated into the Defense Force, and the assumption, the unexamined, unquestioned, devastating assumption, had been that what worked for everyone else would work for them too. "That's why you wanted the kinetic pistol," I said. Understanding arriving the way it often does, all at once, obvious only in retrospect. Most human military forces still use kinetic weapons for specific applications, Kira confirmed. Plasma technology is excellent. I'm not dismissing it. But there are environments where you need a projectile that won't disperse in dense atmosphere, doesn't depend on a power cell that can fail or be disrupted, and will penetrate materials specifically engineered to diffuse energy weapons. Kinetics have a simplicity and a reliability that energy weapons can't entirely replace. I had always thought of kinetic weapons as primitive, barbaric, even a relic of a less enlightened era, kept around for the same reason we kept old flags, sentiment and history, not utility. Standing there in the cooling silence of the range, watching this human with a wrong grip rearrange everything I thought I understood about marksmanship, I reconsidered that judgment entirely. Run the full qualification course, I said. Every distance, every scenario. She ran it. Moving targets and stationary targets. Multiple simultaneous engagements. Targets partially obscured by cover. Friend or foe discrimination drills with non-combatant holograms woven through the threat population, requiring split-second identification before engagement. The full battery of scenarios we use to evaluate recruits at the end of their third week, not their first day. She scored perfect or near perfect on every single evolution. That wrong grip, that compressed stance, and absolutely, relentlessly devastating accuracy. Not lucky accuracy. Not fortunate accuracy. The consistent, repeatable accuracy of someone who has put in an enormous amount of time developing a skill that, from the outside, looks nothing like skill at all. By the time she finished the final course, word had spread through the station the way important things spread. Quickly and quietly, carried by people who had seen something they needed others to see. Instructors from the adjacent ranges had drifted over in ones and twos. Then senior instructors. Then, with a quiet inevitability of command interest in something remarkable, Commander Erix appeared, head of training for Kepler 9. 6 decades of military service across a dozen conflicts, a Telvarian so experienced and so decorated that even the walls seemed to straighten slightly when he walked through them. He stood at the back of the range and watched the final evolution in complete silence. When it ended and the scores appeared on the display above the firing line, he walked forward with a measured, unhurried pace of a man who has long since stopped being surprised by anything and now simply catalogues new data as it arrives. He walked directly up to Kira, studied her for a long, thorough moment, the way a scholar studies a text they are encountering for the first time, and then leaned in close, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The range had gone so completely, profoundly silent that every person in it heard every word anyway. Only Earthborne shoot like that. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact delivered with something that lived precisely on the border between deep respect and deep unease. I was not entirely sure which unsettled me more, the respect or the fear underneath it. Kira met his gaze without flinching, without performance, without the particular tension that most junior recruits displayed in the presence of command authority. "Yes, sir." "How many of you are there?" "In the defense force." "A few hundred, scattered across branches and stations throughout the network. And can they all shoot like you?" She considered this with honest, unhurried care, not rushing to reassure him, not performing false modesty, just actually thinking about the question before answering it. Some better, some worse, but most of us trained to similar standards. Erix was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened to his full height and turned to address the entire room, instructors and recruits alike, all of whom had stopped whatever they were doing and were watching with the focused attention of people who understand that something important is happening. "New protocol, effective immediately," he said. "Human recruits are authorized to use species-specific grip and stance techniques based on their individual biomechanics. Furthermore, I want a complete inventory review of our kinetic weapon stores. If humans can employ them effectively, we keep them maintained and fully accessible." He turned back to Kira. "Report to advanced tactics training tomorrow morning. You are being accelerated past basic qualification, effective today. And I want your techniques documented, written, recorded, demonstrated in detail. If there are hundreds of humans coming through this program, we need doctrine that actually works for your species, not doctrine that was designed for everyone else and handed to you as an afterthought." "Yes, sir." "Dismissed." As the room began to move and breathe again, Thran approached Kira with a careful, deliberate posture of someone doing something they find genuinely difficult but had decided is necessary. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Mocking you was inappropriate. I should have watched before I spoke." Kira shrugged. without hostility, without the edge of someone nursing grievance. You didn't know. Most people don't. We're still new out here, and the galaxy hasn't had much chance to form accurate impressions. But where does it come from? Fran pressed, and now his voice had lost its defensive quality and taken on something that sounded almost like hunger. It's not just technique. There's something else, the way you read the target before it changes direction, the way you already know where it's going, the way you anticipate. Kira was quiet for a moment. The ambient noise of the range, the hum of cooling equipment, the distant murmur of other exercises, seemed to recede slightly, as if the space around had decided to pay attention. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed entirely at odds with her age. Not the performed gravity of someone trying to sound wise, but the simple, settled heaviness of someone carrying knowledge that costs something real to acquire. Earth isn't like most worlds that join the galactic community, she said. We didn't achieve peace before we reached the stars. We brought our conflict with us, thousands of years of warfare, weapons development, combat evolution, doctrine refined through generation after generation of people who could not afford to get it wrong. By the time we developed faster than light travel, we had already spent millennia perfecting every conceivable method of surviving each other. She picked up her gear from the bench beside the firing line. You train for war, hoping you'll never see it. Humans train for war assuming it's coming, not because we want it, but because our history taught us over and over again, at enormous cost, that hope is not a strategy. She left. I stood in the sudden, particular silence that follows a truth being spoken in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Around me, other instructors were already murmuring, already beginning to plan how the training protocols would need to change, what manuals would need to be rewritten, what assumptions would need to be examined and discarded. I was thinking about something else entirely. There were hundreds of humans scattered across the Defense Force. Hundreds of beings who had grown up on a world that had, by all historical accounts, nearly destroyed itself dozens of times before finally, exhaustedly, achieving something resembling unity, who had learned warfare not as theory but as lived experience, passing the knowledge down through generations until it stopped being instruction and became instinct, who had developed techniques and doctrines through trial and error measured not in training schools but in blood over timescales that made our own military tradition look brief and sheltered. And now they were here, among us, in our military, carrying with them skills and knowledge that we had never needed to develop because most spacefaring species had achieved peace before they achieved the stars and had never been required to become truly, deeply fluent in the language of survival. I thought about that grip, that terrible, wrong, devastating grip, about how she had made a plasma rifle, a weapon designed by committee consensus across a dozen species over decades of careful engineering, danced to a rhythm that none of its designers had ever imagined or intended. What else were we wrong about? What other assumptions had we embedded in our doctrine, our tactics, our entire framework of how war was thought about and prepared for, simply because we had never had to fight the way humans had fought? I requested my transfer paperwork that evening. Someone needed to understand these Earthborne, needed to learn what they knew before the inevitable conflict that Kira had spoken of found us underprepared and surprised. Because if one human with the wrong grip could walk into my range and rewrite my marksmanship standards in a single afternoon, I did not want to imagine what hundreds of them could do in an actual war. I was not sure I wanted to find out. But something deep and certain told me the galaxy was going to show us whether we were ready for the lesson or not. 3 weeks had passed since Kira Vance had walked into my range and reduced 6 cycles of marksmanship doctrine to quietly smoldering wreckage. 3 weeks during which Station Kepler 9 had undergone a slow, uncomfortable transformation that the other instructors were now calling, with varying degrees of nervous energy, the human question. The human question being this: if everything we believed we understood about small arms combat was fundamentally misaligned when applied to Earthborne, what else were we getting catastrophically wrong? My transfer had been approved with unusual speed, a fact that itself suggested how seriously command staff was taking the implications of Kira's range demonstration. Human liaison training. They called it. 12 instructors from various disciplines, all tasked with reverse engineering decades of human military doctrine and methodology before someone further up the chain of command noticed we had been training Earth's warriors as though they were slightly unusual Telvarians and always had been. Kira had become our subject. Or perhaps our teacher. As the weeks passed, the distinction between those two roles became increasingly difficult to maintain. Today's session was in the combat simulation room, and the audience was larger than usual. Word had spread through the officer corps in the way that genuinely remarkable things spread, urgently, quietly, and with a quality of disbelief that made people want to witness the source for themselves. The observation deck was crowded with brass and senior administrators who had rearranged their schedules to be here, their expressions ranging from skeptical professional interest to something much closer to open fascination. The scenario was close quarters battle, what the humans called CQB, room clearing, hostage rescue in confined spaces, the kind of tight, consequence-laden, cognitively overwhelming exercise that made most species deeply uncomfortable because the margins of error were razor-thin and the penalties for mistakes were irreversible. Standard doctrine called for a minimum of 4 operators, working in coordinated pairs with clear communication protocols, establishing dominance through superior numbers and positioning before advancing. It was doctrine that had been designed, tested, and validated over generations. Methodical, controlled, reliable. Kira had requested to run the scenario alone. That violates every protocol we have, Commander Eric's noted from the observation deck. He said it the way a scientist notes an unexpected data point, not with disapproval, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who knows they are watching something that will require them to update their model of reality. Human protocol is different, I said. It had become my standard response to nearly everything in the past 3 weeks. I had considered having it inscribed somewhere permanent. The simulation began. 32 rooms materialized in holographic walls and doorways, the layout randomizing as it generated, hostile and civilian populations distributed in patterns designed to be unpredictable. The scenario had been designed for a 4-person team with 8 minutes for complete clearance. The difficulty level had been set at the standard we used for the 3rd week of advanced training. Kira moved, and that compressed stance from the firing range immediately made a different kind of sense in this context. She was smaller in every doorway, less target surface exposed, less silhouette to work with. Her weapon was held close to her body rather than fully extended, in what she had described our training group as a high-ready position, which allowed her to navigate tight angles without the muzzle sweeping walls and betraying her approach or fouling on obstacles in the narrow corridors. First room, 2 hostiles, 1 civilian. She was through the doorway, and both hostile were neutralized before the range computer's threat assignment sequence had fully completed. The civilian hologram had been assessed and cleared in what the system later measured as 0.3 of a second. Freeze playback, Eric said, leaning forward in his seat. We rewound it in slow motion. Watched her eyes move to the civilian first, reading posture, hands, body language, the geometry of how a person stands when they are afraid versus when they are dangerous, and dismiss it as non-threat before pivoting to the actual targets, all of it happening at a speed that was genuinely difficult to pause even in slow motion. 0.3 seconds, said tactical analyst Mvin, a Vian who had spent 4 decades studying combat patterns and whose mandibles were performing the particular rapid-click rhythm I had learned to associate with profound intellectual disruption. That threat assessment took 0.3 seconds. Experienced operators require a minimum of 1 full second for accurate non-combatant identification. That is not possible. Human reaction time is different in threat-specific contexts, I said, pulling up notes I had been assembling with increasing urgency over the past weeks. Faster neural processing for threat detection and behavioral assessment. It's an evolutionary inheritance. They spent millions of years as simultaneously predator and prey on their home world. The competitive pressure of that environment lasted long enough to leave a permanent signature in their neurology. Both predator and prey, Erich repeated, slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them unexpectedly substantial. Simultaneously. Earth had no shortage of things that wanted to eat humans, I said. Humans became very good at not being eaten. They also became very good at eating those things in return. The feedback loop between those two pressures lasted long enough to produce a nervous system that is, in specific high-stakes contexts, measurably faster than most species we have studied. The simulation resumed. Kira cleared 3 more rooms in the time a standard 4-person team would have taken to clear one, moving with an economic efficiency that wasted nothing, no energy, no motion, no attention on anything that did not directly serve the immediate objective. She flowed through the space the way water flows through a structure, finding the path of least resistance and exploiting it completely. Room 5 presented a more complex problem. 4 hostiles, 2 civilians, multiple overlapping lines of fire creating a geometry that made direct entry functionally suicidal. Standard Doctrine prescribed waiting for support, establishing a crossfire position, using suppressive fire to complicate the enemy's options before any team member crossed the threshold. Kira paused outside the entrance for exactly 2 seconds. Then she reached into a pocket of her gear and produced a small metallic disc, a coin, I realized, physical currency from some Earth nation, worn smooth at the edges from handling. She held it for a moment, measuring angles, calculating trajectories in her head with the unhurried focus of someone running a very familiar calculation. Then she flipped it through the doorway with a precise, practice motion. It struck the far wall with a sharp, distinct sound. 3 of the 4 hostiles turned toward the sound. She came through the opposite entrance, low and fast, and all 4 were down before the 3 who had turned could fully reorient to a new threat direction. The civilians stood untouched in the center of the room, their holographic expressions registering a kind of frozen bewilderment. Distraction and exploitation, Vin said, mandibles clicking with what I had learned to read as genuine amazement. That is not in any manual in our database. That is pure situational improvisation, using the enemy's own reflexive responses against them. Actually, I said, turning my datapad toward him to show the document I had found 3 days earlier, it is in several human manuals. They have a term for it, battlefield deception. There are entire chapters dedicated to exploiting enemy expectations, predictive responses, and psychological vulnerabilities. Some of the foundational principles predate recorded human history, passed down through demonstration and practice for so long that the techniques became instinct before anyone thought to write them down. Before recorded history, I watched that land on the people in the observation deck. These beings had been developing and refining combat tactics since before they had a written language, passing the knowledge person to person, generation to generation, through practice and survival rather than documentation, until the technique became so deeply embedded in human muscle memory and intuition that they no longer required conscious thought to execute. Kira cleared 8 more rooms with undiminished efficiency. Her time at the halfway point was 4 minutes 30 seconds. She was moving through a scenario designed for 4 people in 8 minutes, doing it entirely alone, and doing it faster. Then she reached room 14. The scenario designers had called it the impossible room, and they had not been using hyperbole. 6 hostiles, 3 civilians, almost no usable cover, 4 separate entry vectors, each one covering the others, creating interlocking fields of fire that meant any conventional entry approach would be decisively engaged before the operator had crossed the threshold. It was built specifically to demonstrate why solo operations in complex environments were not recklessness but suicide, a controlled, designed object lesson in the limits of individual capability and the necessity of combined arms. Kira stood outside the entrance for a full 10 seconds. The observation deck had gone very quiet. We waited. We waited for her to pause the simulation, to acknowledge the architecture of the problem and recognize its conclusion, to demonstrate that there were things even an Earthborne could not accomplish alone. She set down her plasma rifle. "What is she?" Someone began. She drew the M45 from its holster at her hip. Then, from a second holster position at the small of her back in a configuration none of us had noticed until this precise moment, she drew a second pistol, 1 weapon in each hand. She looked at them briefly, adjusted her grip on both, and exhaled once, slowly. "No," I said very quietly. "No what?" Eric's demanded. "She's going to use both simultaneously. Dual weapon engagement. It appears in Human Special Forces documentation as a technique with very specific applications. Close quarters, multiple threats, confined space, where volume of fire at short range outweighs the precision advantages of single-weapon technique. The literature notes it's largely impractical for most applications, but there are circumstances where the mathematics change. Can she actually? She went through the doorway on her knees, sliding across the smooth floor in a fast, low approach that brought both weapons up simultaneously. The kinetic rounds, physical projectiles, moving at ballistic velocity, considerably faster at close range than plasma bolts, impacted before the holographic targets could register and respond to the threat. The sound of it filled the observation deck, rapid, hard, immediate, with a particular quality of kinetic fire that plasma weapons do not have, a sound that carries weight and finality in a way that energy discharges somehow do not. 6 seconds. 6 hostiles neutralized. 3 civilians standing exactly where they had been, entirely unharmed, their holographic faces wearing expressions of frozen, bewildered survival. Kira stood, holstered both weapons with practiced efficiency, retrieved her plasma rifle from just outside the doorway, and moved to room 15 as though she had simply worked through a moderately interesting problem and was ready to proceed to the next one. The observation deck did not produce a sound for a very long time. Biometrics, Eric's finally said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone issuing an order because it is the only constructive response available. Heart rate, respiration, stress indicators, all of it. I need to understand what we just watched. The data appeared on the display alongside the simulation footage. Kira's heart rate, elevated at approximately 130 beats per minute. Breathing, steady, regular, controlled. Stress hormone levels, elevated but not spiking, consistent in their pattern with what our analysts described as focused moderate exertion, the physiological signature of someone performing a demanding physical task they have done many times before and are comfortable with. She's calm, Vince said. The disbelief in his voice was almost clinical. She just cleared a scenario that was architecturally designed to be impossible, using tactics that should not have worked, with weapons she was not originally issued, and her physiology said she was calm while she did it. Adrenaline management, I said, and I was reading from my notes because I wanted to be precise about this. Human endocrine systems evolved specifically to support sustained high-stress cognitive function. It developed during the period of their evolution when they were persistence hunters, when the tactic was to run prey across open terrain for hours, maintaining both physical performance and tactical awareness throughout. They do not degrade under acute stress the way most species do. Under pressure, they reach a kind of equilibrium with it. Some of their own researchers have a term for the extreme version of this state. They call it flow, a condition of optimal performance under conditions that would produce cognitive impairment in most other species. The simulation completed. Total elapsed time, 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Solo clearance. Perfect identification scores throughout. 0 civilian casualties. A scenario designed to be impossible, completed by one person in less time than it had been designed for 4. When Kira emerged from the simulation room, she found a semicircle of senior officers waiting for her that would have made most recruits visibly uncomfortable. She drank from her water container and looked at them with the settled calm of someone who has answered hard questions before and expects to answer them again. How? Commander Eric's asked. Just that. One word, containing everything. Pattern recognition. Primarily, Kira said, humans are good at reading behavior from limited information, anticipating what a subject will do based on how they move, what they look at, the micro-adjustments their body makes before a larger action. We developed that capability because for most of our history, the ability to read another creature's intentions faster than it could act on them was not a competitive advantage. It was a difference between walking away and not. The dual weapon engagement, Vin pressed, tracking 2 independent target sets simultaneously. The neurology of it should not support the accuracy you achieved. You're right, she said. So you don't track them independently. You aim one weapon with full attention, dominant hand, front sight, trigger discipline, the complete technical process. The other one you direct based on spatial awareness and peripheral processing. It is not precision work, but at close range against multiple threats in a space that small, the objective is not precision. It is volume of fire delivered faster than the threat can respond. The plasma rifle was the wrong tool for that room. Too slow between shots, and the energy signature would have given my position away before I cleared half the targets. The kinetics were faster and quieter. The math changed. You called at the lower risk option, someone said from the back of the group, compared to conventional entry into a prepared kill zone. Kira said simply, yes, I understand how it looks from outside. But the room was designed to eliminate anyone who entered it conventionally, going in fast and unconventionally, with weapons optimized for the specific range and the specific problem. That was a lower-risk option available to me. Sometimes the choice that looks the most dangerous is the lowest-risk option, because all the alternatives are worse. Eric's looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the group of senior officers around him, and then he looked at me, and I saw in his expression the particular quality of a mind that has genuinely and permanently changed. "I want human instructors brought to this station," he said. "I want classified training materials reviewed, doctrine committees convened with human advisory input, curriculum redesigned from first principles. If conflict comes to the outer sectors, and the intelligence assessments have been consistently suggesting for months that it will, I would rather have warriors who are being trained by humans and warriors who are surprised to discover that some of their enemies fight like humans." He paused. "That last part is not a hypothetical concern. Our analyst has specific reasons to believe it is a real and no-term possibility." Kira, who had been listening with her usual contained attention, said quietly, "Then you'll want to move quickly, sir. These things don't tend to wait." Over the following week, 3 human instructors arrived on Station Kepler 9. They came from Earth's various special operations communities, now serving as formal advisors to the Galactic Defense Force, and they brought with them something that none of us had entirely anticipated, not just techniques and tactical frameworks, but a history, a living, obsessively documented, exhaustively cross-referenced archive of human warfare stretching back through centuries, and with it the slow, accumulating, genuinely difficult realization that humans have been refining the art of organized violence for so long across so many different environments and circumstances that they had developed considered and tested methodologies for nearly every conceivable tactical problem. Instructor Marcus Webb had the build of someone who had spent 20 years doing physically demanding things in difficult conditions, and the calm of someone who had made peace with a great deal of what those things had cost him. He arrived with data pads loaded with historical records, training manuals, and video archives spanning centuries, and he set up in the main briefing room with the methodical efficiency of someone who has given this particular briefing many times before and has learned exactly how to sequence it for maximum comprehension. He began from the beginning. "World War II," he said, and activated the first projection. "Mid-20th century by Earth's calendar. Global conflict, not regional, not limited. Every major civilization on the planet involved. Over 60 million dead. This is where we develop most of what we currently recognize as modern combined arms doctrine, the integration of ground forces, armored units, air support, naval operations, logistics, and intelligence into unified operational frameworks. Most of what we teach as foundational strategy in Earth's military academies traces a conceptual lineage back to this conflict. The footage was extraordinary in the way that true catastrophe is extraordinary, not dramatic or exciting, but vast and heavy and difficult to look away from. Cities had stood for centuries reduced to unrecognizable rubble. Landscapes transformed at the geological level. Weapons deployed at industrial scale. The manufacturing infrastructure of entire nations redirected toward the single purpose of producing destruction faster than the enemy could absorb it. And through all of it, humans, adapting, learning, surviving, passing the lessons to each other in real time, because the cost of not learning was paid immediately and completely. This, Marcus continued, shifting to footage that was smaller in scale but somehow more immediate, tight urban spaces, small teams, the close, complicated violence of contested streets, is from counterinsurgency operations conducted over the following decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Urban combat against enemies who were outgunned by every conventional metric, but who understood the terrain, the population, and the limitations of larger forces in ways that created genuine tactical parity. This is where CQB doctrine was refined into the form that Kira demonstrated for you. These are the conflicts where we learned to fight in narrow spaces against opponents who had made a calculated decision to deny us the kind of engagements where our advantages were decisive. Vin's mandibles had been in near constant motion since the briefing began. "You're telling us that humans have direct, documented, operationally tested experience fighting asymmetric conflicts. Opponents who use civilian populations and terrain as tactical assets. Guerrilla warfare. Extensive experience," Marcus said. "Centuries of it, accumulated across dozens of conflicts on multiple continents. And to be completely direct about it, we have been on both sides of those conflicts at various points in our history." He let that settle for a moment. "We know how insurgencies are constructed, how they sustain themselves, how they collapse or don't. We know it with a specific intimacy of having built them, fought them, been destroyed by them, and survived them. That knowledge does not come from reading about it." The implications move through the room with the particular weight of something that matters more than it initially appears to. The Galactic Defense Force was very good at conventional warfare, fleet engagements, planetary assaults, the large-scale coordination of massive forces against a clearly identified, conventionally organized enemy. That was what it had been designed and optimized for over its entire institutional history. But an enemy that did not fight conventionally, that did not present clear lines of contact or accept the terms of engagement that favored the Defense Force's considerable strengths, that was a fundamentally different problem. It was a problem the Defense Force's doctrine had never had to solve, because no spacefaring species in the galactic community had ever needed to develop that kind of warfare before achieving the technological and social sophistication required to join it. Because almost every spacefaring species had achieved peace before achieving the stars. Humans had not. We need human advisors embedded in every combat doctrine committee, Eric said, and his voice had a particular quality of commander who has understood something important and is now arranging reality around that understanding. Every training curriculum review, every strategic planning process, not as a courtesy, not as a symbolic acknowledgement, as a substantive, structural requirement. He looked at Marcus. You've seen forms of warfare that the rest of us have only encountered in historical records. You've survived them, learned from them, built systematic knowledge out of them. That knowledge belongs in our doctrine. Marcus nodded. I can arrange that. But, Commander, there's something important I need you to understand about what we're actually bringing, because I've watched this conversation happen before in various forms, and the same misunderstanding tends to appear. He paused, choosing his word with visible care. What we're bringing isn't just a collection of techniques that you can extract, incorporate, and move on. It's a way of thinking about conflict that is genuinely different from the frameworks most galactic species developed, because it emerged from a completely different kind of institutional history. Humans approach war differently not because we're better at it. We approach it differently because we never had the option of treating it as something that could be prevented by simply being sophisticated and prosperous enough. Explain, Eric said. Most galactic species achieved enough internal peace before reaching the stars that when you developed military doctrine, it was doctrine designed primarily for external threats, defending against or engaging with civilizations other than your own. Humans developed military doctrine to fight ourselves, against enemies who shared our language, our technology, our terrain knowledge, our physiology, and sometimes our specific tactics. Fighting an enemy who knows everything you know, who has access to everything you have access to, who can anticipate your moves because they were trained by the same institutions, that produces a completely different kind of military thinking. You can't rely on technological advantage. You can't rely on unfamiliarity. You have to rely on adaptation, on creativity, on the ability to change your approach faster than your enemy can adjust to it. Kira spoke from where she had been sitting quietly at the far end of the room. That's why the techniques look wrong, she said. They were developed in environments where every obvious approach had already been identified, anticipated, and counted. The only options left were the unconventional ones. The grip that looks biomechanically unsound. The entry that looks suicidal. The tactics that aren't in any manual, because the people who wrote the manuals for the other side would know exactly how to defeat anything that was. She looked around the room at all of us. You train for war hoping you'll never see it. That's a reasonable position when your history supports it. Humans train for war assuming it's inevitable and that the enemy has read the same manuals we have. Those are different problems with different solutions. The room was very still. Outside the station's viewports, space stretched infinite and cold and full of things we could not see from here. The intelligence briefings had been using the word probability with increasing frequency over the past 2 months, where they had previously used possibility. The timelines and the assessments were compressing. The pattern of movements in the outer sectors that the analysts had been tracking for the better part of a year was beginning to resolve into something that had clear direction and apparent intent. Here's what we are going to do, Eric said, and his voice carried a particular finality of a decision that has been made and will not be revisited. Full integration of human combat doctrine into Defense Force training, beginning immediately. Kira, you and the other Earthborne recruit are being transferred to accelerated instructor development. I want you teaching before the end of the month. Marcus, your team works directly with our curriculum designers. We rebuild the close-quarters combat program from the foundation with human methodology as the architecture, not as an addendum. He looked around the room, at all of us, the instructors and analysts and senior officers who had thought we understood warfare until a woman with a wrong grip had walked into a firing range on an ordinary morning and demonstrated otherwise. Earth survived 10,000 years of continuous, evolving conflict and emerged from it as a unified spacefaring civilization. That means they learned something about the nature of war that most species in this community never had to learn. I intend to understand what that is before we need it, not after. He stood. Begin today. 3 months later, the first class of human-trained CQB specialists graduated, and there was something entirely new. I watched them during the final exercise and felt something that took me a moment to identify, because it was not a response I had expected. I felt something close to awe, not at any single performance or any individual score, but at the collective thing they had become. The transformation was visible in everything. The way they moved through space, the quality of their attention, the particular kind of stillness they maintained when they were waiting. They had absorbed not just the techniques, but the philosophy beneath the techniques, the understanding that combat was ultimately a problem to be solved rather than a contest to be won, and that the solution required a mind that was both deeply prepared and genuinely adaptable. Telvarians using the C-clamp grip, their shot groupings tightened into clusters that would have been impossible 3 months ago. Krell employing distraction and exploitation with precision and timing that made Vin stop writing in his analytical journal and simply watch. Vians moving through doorways with kinetic pistols in the low, fast approach that Kira had demonstrated in the impossible room, reading the geometry of confined spaces the way a navigator reads a star chart, not thinking about it, simply knowing it. In 31 of 32 scenarios, the class exceeded the previous graduation record. In the 32nd, the impossible room, now a permanent fixture of the final examination as a matter of deliberate institutional principle, every single member found a way through that their predecessors would have dismissed as fantasy. I stood in the observation room watching them complete the last evolution, and Kira stood beside me wearing instructor's insignia that looked completely natural on her, and for a long while neither of us spoke. The silence between us had the quality of something completed, a long calculation that had finally arrived at its answer. "You changed everything," I said eventually. "One afternoon on a range, 15 minutes late, and you restructured our entire approach to combat training." She shook her head. "I didn't change anything. I showed you what humans already knew, what we had to learn the hard way, over a very long time, at a price that is difficult to describe to anyone who didn't pay it. Do you think it'll be enough?" I asked. "If it comes." She was quiet for a long moment, watching a pair of Telvarian graduates complete a distraction and entry sequence with a timing and coordination that would have been unimaginable when I first met her. When she answered, the words came slowly, with the weight of someone being as precise as possible about something that genuinely matters. "I don't know," she said. "War is unpredictable even to the people who spent the most time studying it. Even humans get surprised. Even humans lose." She paused. "But I know this. You're better prepared than you were. You understand now that there are multiple valid ways to fight, multiple valid ways to think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that the approach that looks completely wrong from outside may be exactly right from the inside, given the history that shaped it. That understanding is worth more than any single technique, because techniques can be counted. Understanding is what you use when the techniques stop working. And if we face enemies who fight like humans..." She turned to look at me, and what I saw in her expression was something I had not seen before, not the patience of someone explaining something familiar, but the older, quieter look of someone who has thought about a particular thing for so long that it has passed through frightening and come out the other side as simply true. "Then you'll have humans fighting beside you who know every trick in the book," she said. "Because nobody, and I want you to hear this precisely, nobody knows how to fight humans better than other humans. We've been doing it for 10,000 years. We wrote the book, burned the book, wrote a better book, burned that one too, survived the wars that should have ended us, learned from every catastrophe, rebuilt after every collapse, and eventually arrived at something that actually works. That process is not something you'd choose. But since you can't choose, since the history is what it is, I'm glad we're on the same side." The intelligence briefing arrived at midnight, and it was not the briefing anyone had been hoping for. I was still in the observation room when the alert reached Eric's datapad. I could see him from where I stood, through the glass partition of the command station, and I watched his expression change. Not dramatically, not with a theatrical shift of someone encountering a surprise, but with a subtle, precise recalibration of a seasoned commander absorbing a fact that he had been preparing for and was now simply receiving. He read the briefing twice. Then he forwarded it to the senior staff with a single line of annotation. Initiate final preparations. All personnel. Tonight, the Outer Sector Patrol had made contact. Not pirates. Not rogue states operating beyond their sanctioned borders. Something that moved in formation with a kind of tactical sophistication that our analysts, in their careful and increasingly alarmed language, could only describe as deliberately trained. Something that had been conducting systematic observation of defense force positions and patrol patterns for what the intelligence community now believed had been the better part of a year. Something that had chosen this particular moment, with the precision of a force that understood timing as a tactical asset, to allow itself to be seen. And something that, according to the fragmentary signal intercepts our teams had managed to partially decode, had been conducting a comprehensive study of human warfare. Not Telvarian warfare. Not Krell tactics or Vian doctrine or the established military traditions of any species that had developed their combat philosophy before reaching the stars. Human warfare. Specifically, deliberately, the news moved through the station the way genuinely important news moves, not with the dramatics of a crisis announcement, but quietly, person to person, with a particular weight of something that changes the shape of everything around it. I watched it reach people in the corridors and the training halls and the mess facilities, watched their expressions process it and settle into something that was not quite fear and not quite resolution, but lived precisely between those two things. I found Kira in the main training hall at 3 a.m. She was running solo drills in the dark, the emergency lighting providing just enough illumination to work by, moving through the familiar geometry of the CQB course with the unhurried, total focus of someone who is not panicking and is not performing calm, but is simply, completely choosing to be ready. She heard me come through the door. She did not stop. "You've seen the briefing," I said. "Yes." "They've been studying human combat methods." "Yes." I stood at the edge of the course and watched her clear 2 rooms with a fluid precision that had not diminished in the slightest since the first time I had seen her shoot. Then she paused between rooms, ejected the training magazine from her rifle, checked it by habit, the motion so automatic it barely registered as deliberate, and turned to face me. In the low amber light of the emergency system, her face was completely, genuinely calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing something, but the real, quiet calm of someone who has already processed what they need to process and has arrived at a place of settled clarity on the other side. "Are you afraid?" I asked. She considered the question with the same honest, unhurried care she brought to everything. "Yes," she said. "Fear is appropriate information in a situation like this. The problem isn't feeling it. The problem is letting it make you slow." She looked at the training floor for a moment, then back at me. 3 months ago, this station would have faced whatever is coming with Doctrine built for a completely different kind of war. It would have walked into this unprepared for the specific threat and confident in frameworks that were wrong for the problem. She paused. "It won't do that now. We changed that. You and I and Marcus and everyone who showed up and chose to learn something genuinely new rather than just refine what they already knew. That matters. Whatever happens next, that matters. Is it enough?" She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, not searching for words, but making sure the words she chose were exactly true. "I don't know," she said. "I'll never tell you I know, because I don't, and you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." She looked at me steadily, and what I saw in her eyes in that moment was something that I have thought about many times since. Not certainty, not bravado, something older than both. The particular quality that comes from having been at the edge of things and survived it, and knowing that survival is not guaranteed, but preparation matters and presence matters, and the people beside you matter, and that sometimes that is genuinely enough. But here's what I do know. They've been studying human warfare. They expect to face a defense force they've been mapping for months. They've planned for the force that existed at the beginning of that observation period. She paused. They have not been watching what this station has been doing for the last 3 months. They don't know what you become. They will plan for the defense force they studied, and they will encounter something different. She picked up the training magazine, reloaded with the practice economy of someone who has done it thousands of times, and settled her rifle back into the high-ready position that had once looked completely wrong to me and now looked like exactly what it was. "Get some sleep, Vaughn," she said. "You'll need it." I did not get much sleep, but I stood in the corridor outside the training hall for a long time, thinking about what she had said. Out beyond the station's viewports, space stretched in every direction, cold and infinite and full of things that did not announce themselves before they arrived. Somewhere in that darkness, something was moving toward us with intent and preparation and the studied confidence of a force that believed it understood what it was walking into. It did not know what we had become. In the graduation hall, the class of human-trained specialists was sleeping the deep, calibrated sleep of people who have prepared themselves fully and have nothing left to do but wait. In the training rooms and briefing centers, Marcus Webb and his team were running final readiness reviews. Throughout the station, in corridors and command posts and observation decks, the defense force that Kira Vance had helped rebuild was making itself ready. And in the main training hall, a small human instructor with the wrong grip was still running drills in the dark at 3 a.m. because she had grown up on a world that had learned, at enormous cost and over immense time, that hope was not a strategy and readiness was the only answer that the universe consistently accepted. Whatever was coming would find a different force than it expected. It would find warriors who had learned to think in human patterns, to adapt in human patterns, to make the kind of fast and unconventional decisions that 10,000 years of survival pressure had encoded into a species that had never had the luxury of forgetting what conflict truly cost. It would find, at the center of all of it, a woman who had walked into a firing range 15 minutes late on an ordinary morning, picked up a weapon with the wrong grip, and quietly, methodically dismantled everything that was wrong about how the galaxy thought it understood war. The right grip, I had finally come to understand, does not look right until you know where it comes from. Until you know the incountable generations of failure and adaptation and survival that shaped it, not in a training facility, not in a doctrine committee, but in the only laboratory that has ever produced knowledge that truly holds, the long, costly, irreversible experience of discovering what works when everything is at stake. Humans called it evolution. We were learning to call it doctrine. Out in the dark between the stars, something was coming. We would be ready for it. This time, we would be ready. The firing range on station Kepler 9 smelled like burnt ozone, and something I had come to privately associate with disappointment. After 6 cycles as a marksmanship instructor at the Galactic Defense Academy, I had grown disturbingly familiar with that particular combination, the acrid bite of ionizer mingling with the quiet humiliation of recruits who had walked through the blast doors convinced they were warriors, only to discover that conviction and competence were 2 very different things. My name is Vaughn. I have been stationed here long enough to have watched 17 different species fail their basic qualification exams, long enough to have memorized every excuse in 7 languages, and long enough to know with complete certainty that the universe is full of beings who mistake bravado for skill. It is one of the few things I have found to be genuinely universal. On this particular morning, I had already watched 17 recruits fail their basic marksmanship examination in the span of 2 hours. 17. The current class was a mixed cohort of Telvarian scouts and Krell shock troops, formidable by reputation, catastrophic on this range. The Telvarians were flinching before they fired. The Krell were hitting everything except the target, their plasma bolts scorching the walls, the ceiling, and at one particularly memorable point, a ventilation grate that maintenance was going to be deeply unhappy about. The target itself, a glowing circle suspended motionless in midair at 50 meters, remained pristine and mockingly unscathed. It had not been touched once all morning. I was beginning to feel a certain bitter kinship with it. I was composing a blistering internal memo to the Academy's recruitment committee when the doors opened. She walked in 15 minutes late. Not jogging, not apologizing, just walking, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had quietly and unilaterally decided that the universe could wait for her. The other recruits turned to stare, and I could not entirely blame them. Humans were rare in the outer sectors, a curiosity that existed more in rumor than in reality. Most people out here had heard of Earth the way you hear of ancient legends, vividly, second-hand, never quite believing the more dramatic parts. Seeing an actual human was, as one of my Telvarian recruits had memorably put it just a week before, like spotting a myth buying a cup of coffee. She was young, Or at least she appeared young by human standards, though I had already learned that human ages were profoundly deceptive. Her gear was standard issue, slightly worn at the elbows, and she carried herself with particular economy of movement I had come to recognize over the years. Not the stiffness of someone performing confidence, but the ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to perform it at all. "You're late," I said, not bothering to soften the edge in my voice. She looked at me with a pair of unsettling brown eyes that seemed to spend exactly 1 second calculating what I was worth before arriving at a modest figure. "Name's Kira Vance. Transport got delayed. Solar flare knocked out the 3rd quadrant docking bay." "The solar flare was yesterday. And bureaucracy," she said evenly, "moves considerably slower than physics." A ripple of barely suppressed laughter moved through the Telvarians. I let it die on its own. I had learned over the years that recruits who arrived cocky sorted themselves into exactly 2 categories, the ones who washed out in the first week, and the ones who became legends. There was very rarely anything in between, and the gap between those 2 outcomes was not always visible at the start. "Grab a rifle from the rack," I said. "You're up after Gernok finishes embarrassing himself." Gernok, a Krell with arms like construction scaffolding and a silhouette that blocked the ambient light, was indeed in the process of a thorough public humiliation. 3 shots, 3 misses. The plasma bolts had found the walls, the floor, and some structural support column that was now quietly filing a complaint through the laws of physics. I began composing a second memo, this one to maintenance. Kira walked past Gernot toward the weapons rack with the relaxed attention of someone browsing a market stall, taking everything in without appearing to look at anything in particular. She picked up a standard-issue plasma rifle, turned it over in her hands, frowned at it in the specific way you frown at something that technically functions but was clearly designed by a committee that had never used one, and set it back down. Then her gaze drifted to the back of the rack, where the old kinetic weapons hung behind a layer of accumulated institutional indifference. Relics, pre-contact era artifacts from the period in galactic history when civilization still used chemical propellants and metal projectiles, what most species refer to, not unkindly, as a barbaric age. They were museum pieces, essentially, historical curiosities that no one had touched in years. "Those aren't for training," I called out, already moving toward her. "Grab a plasma rifle like everyone else." She ignored this with serene efficiency and reached for a Terran M45, a kinetic pistol so old it probably belonged in an archive rather than an armory. She turned it in her hands with a particular reverence of someone greeting an old friend after long absence. Did I stutter? My voice had sharpened to the specific edge that usually produced involuntary posture correction in most species. "Those are display pieces. They don't even have ammunition." Kira crouched down, pulled open a narrow drawer beneath the rack that I genuinely had not known existed, and produced a box of prefabricated rounds as casually as if she had packed them herself that morning. She glanced at the label, then at the other boxes inside. "You've got .45 caliber, 9mm, even some .357 Magnum down here." She looked up at me with an expression of genuine, curious interest. "Someone's been maintaining these. Who keeps old Earth guns oiled and loaded on a Galactic Defense installation?" I had no answer to that, which irritated me considerably more than I let show. "Put it down," I said. "Plasma rifle. Now, or you leave."